Hi, you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. Thanks for joining me. I couldn't decide. I've got a book here by Tara Isabella Burton. I've done a previous podcast on it. It's called Strange Rites, and it's subtitled New Religions for a Godless World. The reason I wasn't sure is that she's not a Christian, but she does such an excellent job describing what's going on in America today. And if we're going to be effective people of faith who would like to let our society know Christianity can be defended, then I think it's important that we know, what are people buying into these days? What are they believing? And so I'm going to do chapter 1. She starts off saying that there was an interview some time ago with Sam Harris, one of the new atheist guys, alongside Dawkins and Dennett and Christopher Hitchens. And he was talking about the rise of secularism, and he was, of course, loving this. He said reason and truth basically are winning out over irrationality and superstition. And in Harris's piece, he says at some point it's just going to be too embarrassing to believe in God. Isn't that interesting? So she says the numbers are bearing this out, that we're kind of walking away from traditional religion. She says in 2007, 15% of Americans said they were unaffiliated when it came to their religion. So they didn't see themselves as belonging to any traditional organized religion. So that was '07. Just 5 years later, it was 15% back in '07, and that number was 20%, and it was 30% when it came to adults under 30. And the numbers are higher still. So roughly, she says, about a quarter of American adults say they have no religion. And she said, if you look at the young millennials born after 1990, and they're the people that I'm seeing in my classes at school, those numbers reach almost 40%. She said they're known as the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. They're the single biggest religious demographic in America and the fastest growing one. Now, let me take a look at when she wrote the book, because I think that's going to be important. If I can get here, I'll tell you why I'm looking for that. It was 2020, so that's now a 5-year-old book. The reason why I mentioned the date of when it was written, I've heard lately that many people have tried living without any faith, tried living without the assurance and support and rational feelings that are in Christianity, and they're coming back. But anyway, she wrote it in 2020. So she said in 2009, 41% of American weddings were in houses of worship. Okay, so 4 out of 10. By 2017, it was down to 22%. So we're seeing this all over the place. But she says, just because people say they don't belong to an organized religion, she's saying that doesn't really mean they aren't spiritual. So I see that as good news. She said only 7% of Americans really call themselves atheists or even agnostic. She said 72% of these nuns say they believe in something, if it's not the God of the Bible. See, I find that really encouraging, because they have a hunger. They want there to be something beyond just this physical world. And if we're good at presenting Christianity, we can tell them how that hunger can be met. Okay. She said 46% of these nuns that she's been talking about speak to God or a higher power regularly, almost half. So I think that's kind of interesting. So they're not traditionally religious, but they're not exactly secular either. So she said what you do notice is they have feelings and experiences are more important to them than institutions and creeds. And I want to pause at that point, because that's something I think we need to be aware of when we're talking to people. In other words, it's strongly emotional, right? Feelings and experiences win out over institutions and creeds. And I think one of the things we could do as Christians is emphasize the emotional power of Christianity. For example, the loss of the feelings of guilt. I mean, how great is that? But anyway, so she said she's going to talk about what she calls remixed Americans, ones that are part of this changing religious landscape. So she says you got the nuns, but you got a larger group than that. She calls them the remixed. So what does she mean by the remixed in religious life? Well, first, She said they're the ones that say, I'm spiritual but not religious. Have you heard that before? Yeah, I have. And that's something like a fourth of all Americans will say that. They're spiritual but not religious. And of course, I think if you hear somebody say that, I think a good response is, well, of course you're spiritual, because we all have a spirit within us, right? We're not just physical beings. So we've got a place that we can start in agreement with these people. Okay, so she says, so who are these spiritual but not religious people? They're slightly whiter, she says, and a little more left-leaning than average. They call themselves politically independent. They more likely have a college degree than other people. And she said religious affiliation plays some role, maybe social or cultural, but where they get their meaning and where they get their sense of purpose and their source of wonder at the world comes outside religious traditions. Now, I would say, and this is me again, but I would say purpose and wonder and meaning, if they're coming from something else besides God and the Bible, I think it's going to be a pretty shallow, thin kind of meaning and purpose and wonder. But that's me. Okay, let's get back to her account here. She said the second group, right? So the first group are the ones that say I'm spiritual but not religious. Second group, she says, are the faithful nuns. They're the ones who they'll say they're unaffiliated, but they hunger or they believe in something bigger. That's 72% of the nuns. That's big. You know, they believe in a higher power. They don't feel like their religious institution is providing them with a sense of community, and they really want that. They're really hungry to have community life. They want to find and create rituals with like-minded people. And I think that's, again, something that Christianity can provide. I think that's wonderful. We have great community inside the Christian faith. We talk about each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. All right, here's the third group. She said, they may not show up in the polls like the faithful nuns and those ones that say they're not religious, but they're spiritual. She calls them religious hybrids. They'll say they belong to a given religion, and maybe they even practice some of it, but they feel okay to disregard elements that don't suit them. So it's kind of like smorgasbord, right? They take a little of this and a little of that. She said about 60% of religiously unaffiliated believe in something like astrology or reincarnation. But she said, you know, it's weird. 29% of Christians say they believe in reincarnation. Well, honestly, good land, that's fundamentally incompatible with Orthodox Christian doctrine. So here we see even people that call themselves Christians are buying into other things besides that. 1 in 8 Americans say their spiritual life has been influenced by Buddhism, but only 1% of Americans actually call themselves Buddhist. Okay. She said there's a willingness in this third group to blur the boundaries of religious traditions and to pick and choose what they like. And we can see that, I see that a lot going on. We're living in a multicultural society, and says people's relationships are mixed, and maybe they have a Buddhist practice, and they have a tarot card and something else. And she says what's going on is we've got spiritual marketplace, right? It's no longer a Christian monopoly where religious consumers would stick with what the Christians tell them to do, but now it's personal packages of meaning, she says. It's just based on your taste. It's based on your preference, which, of course, to me, and I think you'd agree, that's kind of a bad way to pick your religion, how you feel about it, because I think in Jeremiah it says the heart is deceitful, and what we want is not necessarily what's good for us or what's good for our society, but that's where we are in society today. She says the rise of the internet has only intensified that trend that you can customize what you want. More and more people really want a spiritual identity and a community that reflects their values and their lived experience and their sense of self, and they'll get that by bits and pieces, rather than one place like in Christianity. She said, if you take the religious hybrids and you ask the ones that say they're spiritual but not religious, and you mix in the faithful nuns, she said that easily gets to over 50% of the population. All right, so I wanted you to think about that. So when you walk down the street, about half the people you meet are either a faithful nun, right? So she already talked about, she calls them faithful nuns. They suggest they have a belief in something, but they're just not sure what. And those spiritual but not religious people. And the hybrids, right? That's 1 out of 2 people. Wow, I think that's amazing. So she talks about what a religion is next, and I'm going to skip over that section. But I wanted to get to the part that I think is the real highlight of this first chapter. She said scholars have been working like crazy to try to narrow down not just what religions are, but why are they there? What do they function for? What role do they play in our lives? What do they satisfy? And so she says, she's done a lot of reading in this area, and she said there are 4 elements of human need that religions are there to satisfy. Okay, so here's my thought. If these 4 are big for everybody, they should be big for us as far as helping us know how to interact with others. In other words, if we can say Christianity provides these things, maybe we convince them to at least give Christianity a try. So here are the 4. Meaning, purpose, community, and ritual. Okay, so let's go through these 4. She says, let's start with meaning. She said, it's some kind of bigger picture sense of why the world is the way it is. So it's reality, right? Trying to figure out what's going on here, right? A grand narrative, you might say. And she said that's part of the bigger picture, but religions also try to provide an account of what our role is in this big picture. And so that's purpose, number 2. So it allows believers to shape their lives in accordance with that big meaning, right? Why are things here and what's my purpose? So maybe for some people it's to evangelize the good news of the gospel, or unfortunately for others to fight in a holy war, maybe others to get involved politically. But religions provide a framework to link the decisions we make in our lives with the big picture we think is going on with reality. So thinking about meaning, that would be like worldview, right? What's real? Why are we here? What's our problem? Those big things. And then purpose, right? We want to feel that we've got a right to be here and we're going to accomplish something that'll help this meaning get along. And she says third, right? So what's the third thing that religions satisfy? The sense of community. And of course, religions do that, don't they? That's one of the things I love about Christianity. People that are my brothers and sisters, like I mentioned a while ago. My wife and I, years ago, took a trip up Central California on the east side, and there's a little ghost town there, deserted town called Bodie, Bodie. I'd highly recommend it if you ever have a chance. It's not too far from Mammoth. So we walked around Bodie, and there's hardly anybody there as far as just looking at it. It's a town that's deserted. It was, I think, a silver mining town. And a lot of them got burned down, but this one is like a state park, so it's guarded. But you can walk around, there's a church there. And so my wife and I were standing there looking at those pews, looking at the dusty wooden boards and things like that for the floor. And we said, if we'd been here in the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, we could have walked down that aisle and sat in the pew, and somebody next to us would smile, and that would be our brother and that would be our sister. I mean, how amazing is that? Christianity is the world's largest multi-ethnic community. We've got more brothers and sisters around the world in different colors and different places than any other religious group. I just think that's so neat. So members of our religious community is like an extension of our family. So she said today's new religions, they can use the internet to end up in a community that's more digital than physical. So you don't have to sit down next to somebody. You just link with them online. And so she said that's an alternate source of community, new chosen family. Well, I'll just say this. I don't think that takes the place. We're physical beings. We need to physically be around each other. I'm sure most of you remember what it was like to be online during the COVID time. I taught school back then. So I was sitting here at a computer, and dealing with students that were like little tiny postage stamp pictures of their faces. And it just felt really odd. It was so cold and so sterile that it was not good education. I was really glad to get back face to face. But anyway, so community. So there's the third thing that you can get. And then she says the fourth thing that people are saying religions try to satisfy is ritual, right? Those are those solemn, formal occasions where you kind of reaffirm your role in that community, whatever it is. And she said you get things like Eucharist or Shabbat dinners or Friday prayers. But she said today you get rituals like workouts at a fitness center, right? Self-care, or maybe meditation classes or yoga, right? So things like that. And again, I think, boy, those, to me at least, those seem really mild and uninteresting compared to the rituals that churches have. And by the way, a lot of churches are not big on ritual, and I think in a way we lose something by being so casual. I mean, when we're there to worship God, maybe we all need a little bit more ritual. So those are the four areas she said religions try to give us, right? So meaning, purpose, community, and ritual. I thought that was really important. Now, as she gets a little closer to the end of the chapter here, she said the authority, where does authority come from? It's people's experiential emotions, so gut instinct. So they don't like, I'm saying they, the new religious people who don't buy into Christianity and the other older religions, they're very suspicious of society and institutions and authorities and experts and rules of conduct. They don't see them as just, oh, we don't need them. Sometimes they call them evil. So what do they want? They want things like social justice activism, utopianism, sexual revolution, right? Those kinds of things. They all have contempt for institutions and scripts. Here's another thing that these modern people like: authenticity. So they're not fond of rules or doctrines or moral codes. They say, oh, that's too restrictive. They're suspicious of truth claims that don't root themselves in subjective experiences. So catch this. 3/4 of millennials and 67% of the religious nuns say they agree with this statement. Whatever is right for your life or works best for you is the only truth you can know. By the way, I want you to think about that statement. Let me do it one more time. Whatever is right for your life or works best for you is the only truth you can know. Do you notice, by the way, that's a truth claim? But it says you're the only one that can have a truth claim. But here they're telling you, here's our truth claim. So I see that as self-refuting. But anyway, so she said she kept hearing over and over again when she interviewed people, I make my own religion. All right, it's sort of a Tower of Babel thing, right? I'll get my own way to God. So as she wraps up here, she said these new religions are offering an opportunity to seek out spiritual truth, right? They're after spiritual truth and some kind of connection with the divine that's beyond doctrine, right? They don't like doctrine. But it said the problem with these groups is they risk separating Americans from each other, right? We're hyper individualistic as it is, and now what's going to bring us together? Nothing. We're going to atomize, right? We're turning into little bits and chunks that fly off in different directions. And so she said, being personally authentic and our experiences, that we're not going to get together and build a coherent ideological system and something that can sustain our institutions. And she ends the chapter with a really great quotation. Well, it's her statement. When we are all our own high priests, who is willing to kneel? And let that soak in for a second. I love that. I put a star by that. When we are all our own high priests, who is willing to kneel? Right? Yeah, I think that's a good point. Well, I'll end at this point. I guess I'll come back to this book because I do think it helps us know who's believing what out there rather than just charging ahead and trying to convert people. We need to know where are they coming from? What's motivating them? What's giving them purpose in their lives? and then suggesting that Christianity can meet those needs that they have. Well, thank you so much for being part of this, and hope your day is going well.